On a windswept October night in 1998, the Wyoming prairie lay silent under a bright scatter of stars. A young man, beaten almost beyond recognition, bound to a wooden fence in near-freezing temperatures. That man was 21-year-old Matthew Shepard. Matthew's story swept across the United States with the force of a storm. Newspapers the next morning carried headlines about an anti-gay hate crime. Vigils lit up city squares from New York to San Francisco. Celebrities like Ellen DeGeneres and Elton John offered public condolences. President Bill Clinton declared that hate and prejudice are not American values. The image of a gentle, blonde student brutalized for being gay became a rallying point for LGBTQ+ rights and for new hate crime legislation. In 2009, more than a decade later, Congress passed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, expanding federal law to recognize attacks motivated by sexual orientation and gender identity. The accepted narrative seemed simple and tragic. Two homophobic strangers, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, lured Matthew from a bar, robbed him, and attacked him solely because he was gay. McKinney and Henderson were tried and convicted of murder, each receiving 2 life sentences. Their crime became a symbol of the dangers queer Americans faced at the end of the 20th century. For many, that is still the story, complete and unshakable. Yet, as the years passed, a more complicated picture began to surface. Investigative journalist Stephen Jimenez, himself a gay man, spent over a decade interviewing more than 100 people connected to the case. His findings suggested that Matthew and at least one of his killers may have known each other well before that fateful night. Some sources described previous sexual encounters between Matthew and Aaron McKinney, as well as mutual involvement in the crystal meth trade that was sweeping through the Rocky Mountain region at the time. Jimenez argued that the murder may have been fueled as much by drugs, money, and desperation as by anti-gay hatred. The book he published in 2013 ignited fierce debate. Supporters of LGBTQ+ rights feared that challenging the hate crime narrative might hand ammunition to those who minimize or deny homophobia's deadly reality. Activists at the Matthew Shepard Foundation stood firm, maintaining that homophobia was central and pointing out that prejudice and addiction are not mutually exclusive. Some critics of the book dismissed it as conspiracy theory. Others, including a few locals and former law enforcement officers, felt it reflected truths they had suspected all along. The clash revealed a deeper question: who gets to define the meaning of a tragedy? Looking back at Matthew's life complicates the picture further. He was an intelligent young man who spoke 3 languages and dreamed of working in international human rights. Friends described him as gentle and empathetic, but also as someone who struggled with depression and periods of risky behavior. Accounts suggest he sometimes used or sold drugs, and that he had endured trauma, including an alleged sexual assault while traveling abroad, that left deep scars. None of these details excuse violence, but they remind us that Matthew was a real person, not merely a symbol. Like many young adults, he was navigating identity, hardship, and the search for belonging. The same is true of his killers. Aaron McKinney grew up amid abuse and neglect, spending much of his childhood in unstable homes. Russell Henderson's upbringing was marked by alcoholism and poverty. Both were entangled in the meth scene that was devastating rural communities across the West in the late 1990s. Violence, addiction, and desperation were not strangers in their lives. Whether or not homophobia was the primary motive, the environment that night was a combustible mix of drugs, anger, and fear. Understanding these complexities does not diminish the brutality of the crime. Matthew was pistol-whipped, tied to a fence, and left to die in the freezing dark. He lingered in a coma for 5 days before succumbing to his injuries. His suffering remains an undeniable act of cruelty. But examining the full context broadens our understanding of how violence takes root. Hatred can coexist with addiction. Prejudice can amplify desperation. Human lives and human crimes rarely fit into a single headline. Fast forward to 2025, and the echoes of Matthew's story are unsettlingly familiar. Hate crime statistics in the United States have climbed for several consecutive years. Attacks against LGBTQ+ individuals have risen amid political fights over transgender rights, drag performances, and school policies. Online rhetoric has grown more extreme, and violent incidents linked to identity-based hatred make regular headlines. At the same time, America is grappling with a renewed meth and opioid crisis, particularly in rural regions that often lack robust mental health or addiction services. Poverty, addiction, and bigotry still intersect in dangerous ways. In this light, Matthew Shepard's death becomes more than a single historical tragedy. It is a warning about what happens when social prejudice, untreated addiction, and economic despair collide. The question of motive remains important, not to relitigate the past, but to understand the present. If we insist on seeing Matthew only as a martyr to homophobia, we risk overlooking the broader conditions that allowed the crime to happen. If we reduce the murder to a drug dispute, we ignore the very real danger LGBTQ+ people still face simply for being who they are. The truth lives in the tension between these narratives. Voices from the past continue to guide the conversation. Officer Reggie Flutie, first on the scene, still recalls the haunting sight of Matthew tied to the fence, his face streaked with blood and tears. Former President Clinton's statement that hate and prejudice are not American values resonates as both hope and challenge. Contemporary activists point out that whether or not the killers were primarily motivated by anti-gay hatred, the environment of casual homophobia in 1998 made Matthew uniquely vulnerable. Today's advocates draw parallels between that atmosphere and the heated political climate of 2025, where debates over gender identity and LGBTQ+ rights remain flashpoints for violence. Remembering Matthew, then, is less about choosing a single explanation and more about embracing complexity. He was neither a flawless saint nor a cautionary tale of vice. He was a young man with dreams, flaws, and a life that mattered. Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson were not cartoon villains, but deeply troubled individuals whose choices led to an unforgivable act. Society's need for clear heroes and villains can obscure the harder lessons, that violence often grows from overlapping causes, and that justice requires confronting them all. As you watch this story unfold more than a quarter century later, consider what it asks of us in 2025. Have we moved beyond the conditions that led to Matthew's death? Are we addressing the mental health crises, the drug epidemics, and the rising tide of hate crimes with the urgency they demand? Or are we still searching for simple narratives while the deeper problems fester? Matthew Shepard's name now graces federal legislation, educational programs, and countless memorials. Plays like the Laramie Project continue to tour the world, challenging audiences to confront prejudice. His parents, Judy and Dennis Shepard, have dedicated their lives to advocacy and education. Their work honors their son's memory by striving to protect others, regardless of which details about that night in 1998 are ultimately emphasized. Perhaps the most meaningful way to remember Matthew is to hold space for the full truth, its tragedy, its complexity, and its ongoing relevance. He was a human being whose life, like all lives, was multifaceted and fragile. The fence where he was found is gone, but the questions it raised remain. In the end, justice is not only about punishing two killers, it is about ensuring that no one else suffers a similar fate, whether at the hands of hatred, addiction, or the dangerous intersection of both. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, What does Matthew Shepard's legacy mean today? Is it a testament to the progress of LGBTQ+ rights, a cautionary tale about the devastation of drugs and poverty, or both? How can we, in 2025, confront violence in all its forms, without simplifying, without forgetting, and without turning away? The answers are not easy, but the conversation is essential. Matthew's life and death remind us that the pursuit of truth, no matter how complicated, is the path toward real change.